To our symposium on stress coping and mental ill health in esports. We're very happy to have you join us today. Firstly, we'd like to thank Nico, Tobias and the Esports Network team for providing a very professional organisation for the conference. We really hope that our presentation can contribute to that. So just to start with, the team. So my name is Phil Birch on the left-hand side. We've also got Dr. Matt Smith in the middle there in the photo, and then Ben Sharpe on the right-hand side. And we will give our individual introductions as we go through this symposium. So a little bit about me. My name is Phil Birch, as I said. I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Chichester in the UK. My specific interest with regards to esports also tie into teaching. So I currently lead a sports science flow states first year module and also a psychology of esports third year module. So my goal is to essentially use the evidence that we're going to discuss today to inform our teaching practice. And moving on to my research interests, we'll talk about the 2019 study in stresses and coping in a moment, but I'm really interested in performance psychology and how stress and coping can enhance athletes, both in traditional sports and esports, both for performance and their well-being. So I'll talk about the stress and coping paper in a moment, but I have been doing some research in Think Aloud, which we'll come on to later, and how that can be used to examine esports. So just to outline the aims of this symposium, first and foremost, we are going to examine the paper relating to stress and coping on both CSGO and League of Legends. Then Matt will move on to talk about the predictors of mental ill health in first-person shooter games. And then Ben will take the future directions and how we feel and we can progress this area of research moving forwards to really help players excel in their performance, but also maintain their mental health. So just before we really get into the research that we've been conducting, it's very important to define the key terms that underpin our research. So we're using the definition by Isma Pedroza Ramirez et al. 2020, and that esports can be defined as the casual or organised playing of video games in a way that provides professional or personal development to the player. And moving on to mental health, that can be defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realises his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And then in turn, mental ill health refers to the negative state of well-being, and severe mental ill health refers to diagnosable disorders such as depression or anxiety. So we're hoping those definitions can really package and house what we're going to talk about today, so you understand where we're coming from relating to the concepts that we've examined. So you might be wondering how we got into this program of research. And like all good research studies, it actually started in a bar in London about 4 or 5 years ago, where I had a friend, or still have a friend, that worked in ESL. And he was talking to me about why some UK-based players might not be performing to their optimal level, and it might be due to stress. So he showed me a photo and then a video similar to one on the right-hand side of your screen, and my performance psychology brain went into overdrive, thinking about all the different concepts that can influence player performance, coach performance, and how we might go about optimizing performance. So what we did was actually conducted a study to examine the stresses faced and the coping methods used in professional esports players, to really try and answer my friend's question of why is it that some UK-based players weren't performing at their optimum in competition versus training. So we used semi-structured interviews with 7 male professional CSGO players. The information there about their expertise level or experience is on the screen. But most importantly and interestingly, when we look at the stresses faced, team issues, individual issues, scrutiny and criticism, and event issues were the prominent themes that were derived from this data collection. And when we look at team issues, this was the most prominent stressor identified from this research. So communication issues within the team, specifically communication issues between the team and the in-game leader, and also a potential lack of confidence within teammates. And when we look at these stresses, you might be asking, rightfully so, well, so what? What does that mean for a player? What does that mean for a coach? Well, what we can say from this research is that if these players are dealing with stresses such as poor communication, having arguments between the teammates, having arguments between the in-game leader, this enables us to better understand what demands are placed on these players, and then hopefully design interventions that are bespoke for esports to improve their performance. And we'll come back to team issues later, but other things like individual issues, balancing their life-work balance, trying to understand whether or not they've got a contract for the next split, for example, come up time and time again, and scrutiny from the media. So we'll come on to social phobia anxiety later, but there did seem to be a considerable amount of information discussed about behavioural inhibition and not wanting to do media interviews. So that was something that we gained from the data. And also more organisational stresses, such as the logistics of performing in front of a live audience and things changing at last minute with regards to the schedule with arena-based competitions. And on the left-hand side there, you'll see Arnold et al. So Rachel Arnold has done a lot of research within stress and coping within organisational settings. These findings do mirror the traditional sport literature, but it's really given us some information about what stresses players face and how we can try and help those players optimise performance. One very important finding that we also found was there was a high prevalence of avoidance coping within this sample. So one example of the avoidance coping was playing passively. So if you start playing scared, you don't want to give up your frag, you don't want to die, you don't want to make a mistake, just playing really passively and not really going for anything and not playing how you would usually play. And as we know, if you're a member of a team that typically plays aggressively, that will promote you winning, that will promote high levels of performance. And if you're avoiding dying and therefore you're playing passively, that's going to hinder performance. But long term, as we know from traditional sport literature, using avoidance coping is potentially harmful for both physical and emotional health. So that, again, to answer the so what question, avoidance coping isn't a healthy thing to do long term. If we know that the players are using that, we can try and develop interventions to essentially change the way that they're coping with the stresses so they can enhance performance, but also maintain and enhance their mental well-being. Now, we're very lucky off the back of this study to receive considerable media attention globally, which is great to really try and gain some visibility in what we're doing. And from that media attention, from doing different interviews and having different articles written about the study, I was very fortunate to be contacted by Oliver Leis at Leipzig University, and we collaborated on his PhD study to examine the stresses, associated responses, and coping in professional League of Legends players. You might be sitting there thinking, well, how about other esports? So we did try and answer that question in part by looking at what stresses and coping are used by League of Legends professionals. And when we look at the stresses here, we do find similar things with regards to the audience, social media, environmental constraints, as I mentioned before. But very interestingly, performance expectations was deemed to be one of the most prevalent stresses. So wanting to play without mistakes. And again, those team issues coming up again in terms of lack of confidence within teammates. Communication might be a problem, and that might be causing some angst between teammates. And again, if we know that across different esports, we can hopefully use this evidence to underpin the work of practitioners to get them to communicate better, to have more rational performance expectations, and therefore performance will increase, and very importantly, well-being will increase as well. Or that would be a hypothesized prediction. Interestingly, within this study in League of Legends, the coping strategies were a little bit more sophisticated. So what we actually found within this study is that increasing effort through high levels of attention was used once the game got started to really try and cope with those stresses. And other things like the social network was used as well. So having an environment where everyone was on the same page, the coach really understood the players, mums and dads, etc. And I know that was a really insightful talk on parental influence within esports. If we can really try and harness that social network and maybe use increased effort in the right way with interventions, that may be able to enhance our players' ability to cope with this stress, and also that may buffer longer term health issues with regards to mental health. So what we're building up a picture is that there are stresses prevalent. It's good to know about what they are, but most importantly, we're starting to know about coping strategies used to try and buffer that stress. And there's a great deal of work by Oliver Lice and Dylan Poulis, for example, further examining this area. So we're building up an evidence base to really move forward to better understand how we can improve performance and mental health. And on that note now, I'm going to just hand over to my colleague Matt to talk about our recent research examining predictors of mental ill health in first-person shooter esports.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Smith. I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Winchester, and my research interests are very much around the area of social psychology, which is all about how people behave in the social world. So I'm really interested in how esports athletes interact and behave in their environment. I have to admit I've got no specific experience in playing first-person shooter games, although after being involved in the research previously, I do now, my understanding is certainly developing in that area. My own real experience in esports is I've played some competitive chess online, so that there is some experience there. And my research interests, as I say, social psychology. I've been involved in research looking at stressors in for example, in cricket captains. And so that led, it was quite a natural progression to look at stressors and coping in elite esports competitors, the study that Phil's just talked about. I've also been very interested in looking at mental ill health because the incidence of mental ill health in sport is certainly on the rise. And so that's something that I'm interested in combining these interests to look at mental ill health in esports and how esports athletes are affected. And certainly the anecdotal evidence suggests that mental ill health is becoming a more prominent area that we need to address. So the underpinning rationale for our research is how can we support the mental health of esports athletes? And there's a couple of examples on the screen of high profile instances where esports athletes have been affected by mental ill health, or there's been a call to really look after the mental health of esports athletes. And as I said, like there's lots of anecdotal evidence through reports in the media of this being an issue. And so our rationale for the research is that there's not much research done in this area. There's a handful of studies, for example, research of Pereira et al., who have looked at how stress might predict mental ill health. And that was really the rationale for our research. We want to understand what might predict the mental health problems occurring in esports. And so the way we designed the study was we were interested in looking at stressors, which built on the previous work that we'd done in esports. And then we thought of what are some of the key mental ill health variables. So we considered psychological distress, we considered general anxiety and depression, and we also considered more severe depression symptoms. And then we read around the literature and we looked at what other variables might be pertinent in this area. And certainly sleep quality is one variable that seems to be very important. And the work of Daniel Bonner and colleagues are starting to give quite a bit of evidence to show that sleep quality can link with mental ill health. Also, we thought of looking at burnout and exhaustion. And one of the things that emerged from our previous research was the issue of social phobia anxiety in terms of how athletes are concerned with how they're perceived and evaluated in a public environment. So this led to our key research questions of looking at these, how stress, sleep, burnout, and social phobia anxiety work to predict mental ill health. And in terms of so what of this research? Well, the key reason that we're doing this is because, as I said, mental ill health is increasing and more people are being affected by this. And as you've seen with other presentations, there's more and more people working in this area in esports, sports psychologists, mental health practitioners working to support esports athletes. And if you're going to support them, then really there needs to be an evidence-based approach to underpin that work. So what we've hoped to do with this research is to provide that evidence, to give some clear findings to suggest, well, if you're working to support the mental health of esports athletes, here are some of the things you might look at in that work. So in terms of the research that we're talking about here, we've started with a sample of student esports competitors, and the findings we're going to present are based on a sample of 313 athletes who all compete in first-person shooters. So there's 3 games that we looked at, Counter-Strike Go, Valorant and Rainbow Siege 6. And we collaborated with an organisation called the Mule, which were a group who organise university esports competitions, and that helped give us a sample of participants to allow us to investigate this question of what are the elements that predict mental ill health. And to start with, in terms of, we developed a survey, and the first thing we need to do was to ask questions around stressors that the athletes experienced. So the way we went around doing this was we looked at previous research that looked at stressors. We looked at our own research in esports. We looked at the work of researchers such as Himmelstein, who looked at stress in esports. We also looked at other research in sports psychology, for example, Rich Thelwell's work on stress in cricket. And we developed a bank of stressors. I think we had 57 in the end. And then what we did was we gave them to key stakeholders, and they identified out of these 57 which ones were pertinent in the sample of student athletes we were looking at. And this resulted in a final selection of 33 stressors. And what we did was we then, part of our survey, we gave these to our participants, and they had to rank how much these things impacted them. So a simple example was the stress of personal form, or a decline in form. How much does that cause you stress? And after we'd done that, what we did was we used a statistical technique called principal component analysis to develop 7 categories of stressors that our sample were affected by. So some of these are quite obvious. So category 1 that you can see on the screen is around the stresses of teammate interactions. So the stress caused by interacting with teammates. Others, for example, I won't go through all of them, but for example, personal concerns would talk about athletes' concerns about their own contributions they make to the team, or things that's around fear of failure, or things like that. So that was the way we were able to measure stressors. And then in terms of all our other variables, we used established questionnaires. So for example, you can see on the screen the questionnaires we used to measure sleep, burnout and social phobia anxiety, and the measures we used to measure psychological distress, general anxiety and depression, and severe depressive symptoms. And all these questionnaires have been validated and been shown to be reliable in other settings. So we were confident that these would provide accurate measures of these constructs. So that's what we did, and so it gets on. And so the key bit now is to get onto the findings of what we found about what were the links between our variables and what we could understand about mental ill health. So our first research question was to look at how the stressors impact on the different variables that we considered. So you can see on the table on the screen that stressor categories 2 and 6, and I'll talk about which ones they were in a moment, they had a significant prediction of having certain elements of poor sleep quality. And just on the right, the numbers are to do with the regression weights. We used regression to look at these predictions. So those figures talk about the percentage of, or the strength of that prediction. So I won't go into that too much, but intuitively, the stronger that number, or the bigger that number, the stronger the prediction. We also found that these 2 key stressor categories, 2 and 6, predicted certain elements of burnout. Stressor categories 2 and 7 predicted social phobia anxiety. And then in terms of our second research question, 2 of our main stressor categories predicted mental ill health. And just to bring all that together and draw together the key points, In terms of the stresses that esports athletes faced, our findings indicate that the key risk factors are stressor categories 2 and 6. So stressor category 2 was the personal concerns, and stressor category 6 is around game-specific uncertainty. So various elements around playing the game, around things that happen while the game's actually going on. Those are the key stressors that were impacting on our sample. And so the results show that they are the key stressors that we might consider dealing with because they're the risk factors of our various variables. In terms of the measurements, just to put it into context, on the right, the beta values, there's a value, and anything between 0.15 and 0.35 is considered to be a medium strength prediction. So all these links between stressors and the different categories, we would categorize as medium strength. So pretty strong predictors and things that we need to consider. Moving on to the third research question, you'll start to see even stronger predictors. So for example, 2 of the elements of sleep quality, daytime dysfunction and sleep disturbance, actually were very significant predictors of the mental ill health variables. So our results were showing that there was a definite link between certain elements of sleep quality and mental ill health. Similarly, we found some very strong findings around burnout and the categories of exhaustion and reduced sense of accomplishment. And these categories of burnout were again significantly predicting our mental ill health variables. And finally, again, social phobia anxiety was a strong predictor of the mental ill health variables. So bringing all that together, all of our variables appear to be risk factors in terms of predicting mental ill health. So anybody who's working with, so sports psychologists or practitioners, mental health practitioners working with esports athletes, our results give some evidence that we really need to consider sleep quality, burnout and social phobia, because our results are showing that these are significant predictors of mental ill health. And if you look on the right, the beta coefficients, they actually represent even stronger predictive strengths of these relationships. So some of these predictions were very strong. So just to give you, I won't go into all the specific examples, but to give you a couple of specific examples, the daytime dysfunction in terms of sleep was actually a very, very strong predictor of severe depression. And in terms of burnout exhaustion was a very, very strong, very large predictor of severe depression. So we haven't got the scope in our presentation to present all those individual findings, but the key findings were that our findings definitely give evidence that sleep, burnout and social phobia are predictors of that. And our findings give evidence that certain elements of this are very strong predictors. So it's something that we hope that, again, going back to this question of so what, anybody watching this who works with esports athletes, there's some evidence there that these might be aspects that you can look at when you're working with athletes to hopefully, if you can improve sleep quality or you can reduce burnout, these might be things that will enhance the quality of mental health of esports athletes. There are some limitations of our research that are worth mentioning. We have to admit that it was, while we looked at competitive esports athletes, we would like to replicate the study with professional players. So we know that we can be more confident that our findings replicate in a professional environment. And we've got some links with different organisations to move forwards with that work with professional players. And then there's some limitations, which I'm not going to go into too much, but our design was a cross-sectional design. So we have to be cautious interpreting the findings, because while we're saying that, for example, sleep predicts mental ill health, there could be some issue in terms of reverse causality, where it might be the other way around, where mental ill health is causing a lack of sleep quality. So we've got to be careful of that. And one of the things that we'd like to do to really strengthen this is to do more longer term longitudinal designs, which would really strengthen our analyses. So there are some of the limitations of our research, but what we are pleased with is that here is some very strong evidence with a strong sample of esports athletes that provides evidence, a starting point for practitioners, mental health mental health practitioners, sports psychologists working with esports athletes to underpin their work in that environment to help support the mental health of athletes. So that's a summary of the research study that we've just completed, and the study is in review and hopefully will be published soon. And that's that section completed, and I'm going to move on to my colleague Ben Sharpe, who's going to talk about where we might go in future with this programme of research.
Right, hello everyone. My name is Benjamin Sharpe, as Matt just said. So I'm a lecturer at the University of Chichester in psychology. I'm also a final year PhD student looking into the neurocognitive underpinnings of performance. I've also was a CSGO source competitor between 2009 and 2012, a long time ago. I was competing in a team called Dreamers, which is probably long since disbanded, competing in local arenas around England, such as there was, what was it called? There was local Comic Cons at the NAC Arena, competed in Birmingham and Nottingham, very localized in England, but that's where my first interest in CSGO started long ago. And now since I'm a CSGO player and just general fan, following the likes of like Hiko and Shroud since years and years ago. So the considerations I would like to talk about today, which really are going to hopefully propel us for future research and can hopefully lead to future collaboration with researchers listening. I want to talk about the psychophysiological measures that could potentially help us in aiding the influence of stress or even the prediction of performance, neurocognitive processes, which are more aligned with my expertise, such as looking into perceptual cognitive expertise, further focusing more on Matt and Phil's expertise, such as think aloud or team dynamics. And then an area that I would really like to focus some attention on is just the measures of focus, the problem with measuring performance in realms of League of Legends, CSGO, Valorant, and so forth. So initially, I want to talk about heart rate variability. So this is simply the variability in consecutive heartbeats, the variation between that and how we can measure it. When watching the sleep symposium yesterday, they spoke briefly about heart rate variability as a means to track sleep quality. Heart rate variability can also be used to monitor the influence of a stressor on the individual. And this is a really fruitful avenue that I would like to go forward and focus on. The main problem with any research related to almost every variable is just definitions. It might be all well and good that we've done mental ill health research, but we've strictly defined what we mean by mental ill health. The same if we want to use heart rate variability to measure stress, it's important for us to measure stress. But in terms of coming together as a community to define a unified measure of what we mean by stress is really important, which is something I want to stress, and for us as a community to come together and talk about what that really means. In terms of technology, here at the university, we have various methods from Pharos monitors to biopacks, but the use of heart rate variability can extend far beyond this into Fitbits, the new iPhones, some Apple Watches, and so forth. But the main focus for us is how specifically can we measure and monitor the influence of a stressor on the individual, how different mental ill health symptoms might influence performance as predicted by changes in heart rate variability. And the more broad question is, can heart rate variability uniquely contribute to the prediction of performance? Next, and more aligned to my personal expertise, is different neurocognitive systems such as eye tracking technology or cognitive measures. You might have heard some of these cognitive measures such as Stroop tasks, MBAC tasks, working memory capacity, executive function. Typically, these are all areas associated with the prefrontal cortex, where the eye and vision is more associated with occipital lobe, which you can feel at the back of your head. So initially, health monitoring, different aspects of mental ill health or just declines in overall physical and mental health usually show themselves as deteriorations in speech. But one of the main aspects in perceptual cognitive expertise is a change in eye movement. So by eye movement, I mean gaze behavior. So how long you fixate on certain areas. So within CSGO, this may be the fact a novice will solely focus on the center of their screen, where experts may be able to use the maps, look at other players, predict where someone may end up in the future. The main cognitive paradigms we could look into are aspects of working memory capacity and executive function. Executive function meaning more broadly reasoning and planning ability. But again, in historical research over the last 15 to 20 years plus, it seems to be these are predictors of performance. And the most interesting thing for our research in stress, those predictions of performance can be moderated or mediated by different mental ill health symptoms. So it might be all well and good saying those that have high working memory capacity perform better, but if they're depressed, have aspects of burnout, this may mediate or moderate that interaction, meaning even if they have high working memory capacity, they may not perform optimally just because they have burnout, as Matt mentioned earlier. Next, again, this is tying more towards Phil and Matt's expertise, so team dynamics, so specifically understanding the interaction between the player or the players and how they communicate with the coaches, how this communication method might be monitored for future research. So we're quite interested in how this interaction occurs during competitive games, whether this can be measured and monitored, and whether certain practices might elicit better performance where others may be leading towards certain stresses that could be avoided. Secondly, the think aloud. Erickson and Simon are almost the originators that first did some prior research on this if you want to do some more reading. But the main aspect to think aloud is talking as you go in, the first processes that come into mind, saying aloud, using these measures and metrics as a way of providing intervention, how best someone approaches a certain practice. And these are things that can be and are currently adopted by practitioners in the field. The one area of focus that I said at the beginning that I'd like to focus on is just measures of performance. A common limitation across most cognitive sciences and also extending into physiology, biomechanics and so forth is just how we measure performance as a whole. Maybe some people are listening now that have used a specific measure of performance, whether it be League of Legends, Counter-Strike, Valorant, or just sports within the traditional sporting realm. But a lot of these have the fundamental limitation of, do they provide ecological validity or do they provide task representatives? As in, do they measure exactly what we want them to do? So, for example, if we're measuring Counter-Strike performance, are we solely measuring reaction time? And does reaction time encapsulate every aspect of Counter-Strike performance? The answer is simply no. We all know the highly dynamic nature of different video games, how complex they really are. They require strategy, teamwork, and so forth. So a measure and a problem that we're trying to tackle going forward, and we think we are in the process of developing such a metric, is how can we measure this performance in a way that truly encapsulates what the game is, as opposed to solely focusing on one measure, such as reaction time, or where they look, or the use of just a map, or just communication, using these things to provide a more performance index as opposed to a single measure. And then again, the latter point, replication and power. A lot of problem with growing fields is that people will simply use a convenient sample. They'll use smaller sample sizes where these aren't statistically powered, meaning we can't reliably rely on the data that is providing us. For example, some of the measures of regression, for example, require between 100 and 150 participants to produce reliable statistics. Well, a lot of limitations with current literature, especially in the cognitive field, are using sample size of 6 to 12 and so forth. And then replication, the same way, and the fantastic thing about this current presentation is that it's open access. People can see it from the public. We're all sharing our ideas and information. The same thing needs to be applied within a research field. It's important for us to say how we produced our methods, what tasks did we use to measure performance, how do we run our statistics, can we offer our finalized data to other members of the research community so they can also find further considerations. So before we progress, I'm going to pass it back to Phil Birch, and he's going to speak about his PhD studentship that has been recently advertised. Thank you very much for listening to myself, and I'll pass it over to Phil. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so just to finish up today, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about our plans with heart rate variability as a measure of emotional regulation, but also longer term health. So essentially next Friday, we're going to be interviewing some PhD students, candidates, and there's a plan of research over the next 3 years to essentially examine the utility of heart rate variability as a mark of emotional regulation and long-term mental health. And our goal there is to try to monitor stress and mental health within esports. And as we've been saying, you might be thinking, so what? If we can have an objective measure of stress reactivity, emotional regulation, potentially with regards to mental health as well, because the evidence is suggesting that those things can be measured from heart rate variability. This may be able to inform and underpin interventions in the future for practitioners to work with their athletes to optimize performance, but also to maintain and increase mental health. So if you've got any thoughts or you want to collaborate, or you've got access to participants, then please get in touch, because that would be great to speak to you in the future. So just to finalise today, there's contributing authors to our study. So both Ati and Dave, thanks very much for your contributions. Special thanks to ESL and Newell and the conference for, again, enabling us to have the platform to speak to you today. And we'd very much like to take your questions. Thanks very much for listening.
Would you like me to read some questions to you that we've got?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
So you jump in, which I wouldn't mind to answer. So in your study, what seems to be the most effective coping strategy?
So is that the 2019 study?
Yeah, so this was when you were doing your talk.
I'll start off by saying that it wasn't actually the purpose, it was beyond the scope of the study to actually evaluate coping effectiveness. So the aim was to illustrate what the stresses were and then what some of the coping strategies that the participants used. We actually made some statements around what we thought was effective or not. So when the participants talked about avoidance strategies, then we suggested that wasn't very effective, because the literature has suggested that avoidance strategies aren't the best way to cope with things. But it was beyond the scope of the study to actually specifically assess how effective the coping strategies were. Certainly something that future research can look at.
Yeah, so is there data statistics that show the level of mental ill health is increasing, and we need to be more open with the issue of mental health within esports?
So my understanding is that there are few studies examining the prevalence or level of mental ill health in esports. There is some research by Anna Pereira and colleagues that has potentially looked at more the prevalence of mental health in esports, but I think that is a area that we need to target more in the future in terms of prevalence. But just to be very clear, our study wasn't examining prevalence. Our study was trying to examine the predictors of mental ill health, so we can understand the risk factors to help practitioners optimize their performance in helping players and coaches.
Another question is the mental ill health a result of high stress environment, or are there risk factors in the player beforehand that worsen the effect of high stress, like their age, but also physiological problems before becoming pro?
Very good question, and that's something that goes beyond what we did, but there's always other things you can look at. So for example, are there certain personality factors? Are there certain predispositions? Are there certain age groups? And something we didn't look at, because you've got to draw a line on what we did. So we've looked at all our results together and the overall findings. And yeah, there's a whole range of things that we could look at again in future research. So yeah, there's certain aspects that we potentially could look at, but there's things that we didn't look at in this study. We looked at all our results together.
I think just to mention what Ben said in his part of the presentation in terms of moderators and mediators, I think moving forwards, using more complex analyses, you will be able to establish what those variables are and how they influence the predictions with regards to mental ill health. So something like personality, for example, as Matt said, that could be tied into future research to examine its potential.
So for example, you could develop some intuitive hypotheses around maybe extroversion would mean that people wouldn't be affected by social phobia anxiety, but maybe more introverted individuals would struggle by being evaluated. So we can make those hypotheses, and that's certainly something that is a lot of potential for further research. Our thinking was to have a starting point by providing some initial evidence, and then now we've got some evidence, then we make some decisions about where we move forwards from here.
Another question, which we may have covered slightly, is if you change the type of game played, for example, a fighting game, do the measurements change?
So we obviously don't know that because we've used a sample of first-person shooters. So that's a very interesting question. And again, whether we run the study in another sample with and that would be something that would be interesting to get some reflections on from that community. Like that might be a different type of study. It might be an interview study where we take those results and then say, well, do these resonate with another community, and present the result to those who play fighting games and say, right, we found that sleep might predict this. Do you find that? We find that burnout predicts this. I think quite a few of our findings, though, I'm imagining the result of playing the game in general, not the type of game. So my instinct would be that sleep quality and burnout would be pertinent regardless of the game. But that would be my instinct, not based on any actual research findings.
Thoughts on that one?
No.
Cool.
Yeah. This is a question by Tristan. He joined slightly late, but he asked if there's some signs of high depression as well as in athletes, so such as sleep problems. So maybe you could revisit the sleep depression potential link that we found.
Yeah, and I suppose that's like we just said, it's a follow-up study. So we didn't specifically look at prevalence in terms of how much depression was being experienced or what symptoms were being experienced by players. But yeah, looking at the links in the clinical literature between things like sleep quality and depression, especially things like daytime dysfunction, the links are there. So again, you can make the application of those links and suggest that there could be viable studies to look at that. But again, we haven't got the specific evidence. We haven't got enough specific evidence to formulate any concrete conclusions on that yet. But
certainly that was a very strong finding. So daytime dysfunction sleep was incredibly strong in terms of the regression weights in terms of predicting mental ill health.
Mm-hmm.
So there appears to be something there, and that would certainly be worthy of future research because it was such a strong finding.
And if you are interested in sleep in esports, Daniel Bonner's work and other colleagues would be a really good place to go to examine the current literature to understand where we're at. And in the results sections and the discussion sections, they'll be talking about what could be done next. So yeah, read those papers because they're really good starts.
Yeah, I think this also ties to yesterday's talk on circadian rhythm and sleep. The main point that we're trying to get across is that there's different chronotypes, morning and evening chronotypes. Our most common issue, just from anecdotal reports from just esport players I play with at our professional, semi-professional standing, a lot of them take medication to fall to sleep. And the problem within sleep literature is that they can't fall into the REM stages 4 and 5 of sleep if they're taking these medications. They're not having the sleep spindles in the brain. They're not releasing cortisol naturally, and they're not recovering. And as a result, their immune system is hampered, which could then lead to further aspects of falling ill, aspects of burnout. But again, this is a really interesting area that we would love to explore further. But also points to what we mentioned earlier is that we used a Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and the problem with the Sleep Quality Index is also a subjective measure, which also ties back to Phil's PhD student using heart rate variability. This is just another metric where we can, instead of asking the person what is their subjective opinion of their sleep, can measure it externally or provide them with a mechanism to measure their sleep quality over time, which again is just a really fruitful and hopefully really important avenue that should be pursued in future research. Question. So team communication was mentioned as a way to monitor, observe and give insight into team dynamics. What methods would you use to capture this?
Well, there's has been research in terms of, there was a very interesting study on net communication netball, where how defenders communicate, and what the researchers did was they coded the communication and the different things they did, and then they actually looked at whether that linked with performance. And I wonder whether that if when, because communication is recorded when people are competing, if we could devise a coding system where we looked at the different types of communication at a basic level, for example, positive and negative communication, instruction, criticism, those sorts of things, and then if we could code that in a similar way, and the netball study was a really interesting one, and then we look at, like, for example, does that lead to success or failure? So there are a couple of studies that have done that, and I think that'd be really interesting, because the interviews I did were with competitors who are competing in a live event. And so it's interesting when people are used to competing online, and then suddenly they go to a large scale live event, maybe with an audience, and they have to communicate in person, then some of the issues around that. So I'm very interested in team dynamics. So I think that could be a very fruitful area to look at. And then from a sports psychology perspective, how do you work with athletes and train them to communicate more effectively?
And just to add to that, I think building a supportive environment from the team to the IGL to the coach to the support staff, again, using Think Aloud, you could try and capture some of their thoughts and some of their communication to understand how the IGL is communicating with the team, how the coach is communicating with the IGL. And again, we're providing preliminary evidence to suggest that the coach and the IGL have very prominent roles in shot calling and some esports and communication. So the different pairings and the different groups of communication in a team could be something really interesting to examine.
Can you still hear us? Can you still hear us, Nicholas? Our screens went black for a moment.
I can't hear him.
Sorry.
Can you still hear us?
Yeah, we can
Okay,
see.
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question was, what would you say we could use heart rate variability and eye tracking as indicators for training or grinding sessions too long? So I guess, do you want to answer this one?
You go.
So an interesting aspect of eye tracking research is that the aspect of vigilance, so the decline in performance over time. An interesting thing you find with those that have high or low working memory capacity, or high or low executive functioning, or just a certain prevalence to follow a specific gaze strategy, you'll find that over time, depending on the level or expertise of this individual, you will see a decline in their specific performance on that variable. So eye tracking specifically, you might find in the first 5 minutes of play, they're making lots of fixations consistently across the screen, or they're making very little. But depending on the expertise of that individual, you'll find that their gaze behavior will change dramatically, and that might be a predictor of performance. So I know within my own personal research within lifeguarding, it seems to be the case that over a 60-minute period, the more focus is attended to maybe a monotonous task or understimulating task, your ability to attend your attention may worsen, and as a result, your performance would decrease. Similar to heart rate variability, it may be the case that heart rate variability, as tracked over a long period of time, may be a predictor of performance during that time. So the more stable you can sustain your heart rate, that we were speaking about in yesterday's session on breathing rates, controlling your breathing as a way of relaxation, it just might be another metric we can maintain performance over these long stints. Because as we're all aware, especially in League of Legends, games can be 60 minutes. If they're back-to-back in a tournament period, they're playing consistently for 4 or 5 hours or more. Does the time of your sleep schedule change your results? Like if you slept during the day as opposed to slept during the night, would it affect your sleep or in-game performance? That's by someone called Jack.
Our findings, and I don't believe the measure that we used, Ben, actually breaks that down. So again, all these things are very interesting things we could look at in the future. So this is always what happens in research. You do an initial finding where we've got some evidence that sleep can link with mental ill health, and then some of the things that have been mentioned in the questions about are very relevant in terms of we could investigate in future, because it's obviously not as simple as that. There's something going on in terms of our results. There's definitely something going on between sleep quality and mental ill health, but then that's where that provides the impetus to go and then break that down and look at things. So I don't know who it was who asked that question, Ben.
Jack,
but that's potentially something that's very relevant, because sleep can be different in terms of the playing schedules, for example.
I think as well, if you're interested in that particular question, you can read the work of Professor Matthew Walker. He's also released a book called Why We Sleep, and he talks about the importance of going to bed when it's dark outside. And he also talks about the different types of chronotypes. So some individuals, I know speaking for myself, I can perform optimally with 5 hours of sleep, where that's not necessarily typical for average population. Some people might need 7 hours, some need 8, some need 9. It's understanding for you individually how much sleep do you require? And the same thing for naps. The suggestion typically is have 20-minute naps in the middle of the day before a meal or before a meal. But again, for some people, it's either not achievable to have because you have other family commitments, or a nap for you doesn't actually provide that benefit. So I think it's being mindful and self-aware of how much sleep you personally need, how much, if you do go to bed, when's your natural wake-up time. But yeah, I recommend you have a look at Professor Matthew Walker's work. It's a really interesting question, but yeah, not the scope of what we've researched currently. And that's all the questions we've got on Twitch.
Nicholas, is there anything else that you think we've missed in terms of the questions? Or have we covered them all?
Actually, I think that you answer all the questions that have been asked on the Twitch chat. I put them in our conversation. I don't know if you can access in the discussion in the Zoom, but I think that you did great.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Feel those. Yeah, I think we've answered all the questions then.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to you guys.
Great work, Nico, for organising this.
I appreciate. Thanks to you to participate to this. Actually, fantastic job, and actually, for what I've seen in the chat, all the people were really interested in the research you are conducting and what you are saying. So yeah, it was a high level conference with you guys. Great
Thanks very
symposium.
much.
No, you did great. Everybody is thank